Welcome. Today we're talking to Hyrum LeBaron, who was born into a murderous cult, but has somehow managed to lift himself out of that past experience. So welcome to Life After with Jesse and Courtney. My name is Jesse Cross, and I spent 19 years in prison and rebuilding my life.
And I'm Courtney Stewart. I'm a investigative journalist. I have done many stories over the years, focusing on difficult situations and people and how they move through them. And so I am so excited for this conversation with Hyrum. Hyrum, thanks for doing this.
You're welcome.
So your story, your family's story, is the subject of an ABC News Studios docuseries called Daughters of the Cult, which is now streaming on Hulu, and which I watched. And it's a pretty shocking, incredible story, not only of what your family, you and your siblings lived through, but also where you've all ended up. Would you mind just giving us just a little back history on the cult that you were raised in and sort of the environment that developed in?
I would like to give a little bit of history of like the founding, like where my dad came from. He just wasn't somebody that just randomly decided to start murdering people.
Yeah, and your dad's name is Ervil
LeBaron,
LeBaron, and people may have heard of him. He's been referred to as the Mormon Manson.
Correct. And he had a lot of people murdered in the name of religion, in the name of the cult. He never murdered anybody himself, but he had a lot of people murdered for him. But I'd like to give your listeners a little bit of history so they can have something to kind of hang their head on, like where that came from. And it's basically, if you go back in U.S. history to the early 1800s, there was kind of a religious revival going on. There was a lot of, the tent rolling into town and the revival show, and everybody goes and hears a preacher do a thunderous sermon and people get baptized. That was going on in the United States pretty strongly, and there was a lot of fervor around it, and people were getting back to fundamental Christianity, essentially. And there were several different religions founded in that time frame. And one of those was the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, founded by Joseph Smith. And I've never heard any other scholars say it this way, but I always kind of considered Mormonism to be kind of a fundamentalist Christianity with some twists. But I think Joseph Smith was a con artist. That's my interpretation of that. And he founded this religion based on, his claim was that he found he got a revelation from God and Jesus and the angel Moroni, and he showed him some golden plates that he translated, because they were in a foreign language. He translated via a stone that was called a Urim and Thummim that he would place inside of a hat, and then he would put his face in the hat and read. The stone would translate what these golden plates said, and that was the Book of Mormon.
It was funny because the first time you said that, I immediately saw the sorting hat from Harry Potter. And I was like, it makes sense. It's consistent.
I don't know what kind of hat it was, but I don't know if it looked like that. But anyway, it was its own little brand of religion that had some tenets that, in its founding, that the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, how they prefer to be called, the mainstream Mormon religion, which I'll just refer to in the future as LDS for Latter-day Saints, they don't practice anymore. They've gotten away from that, much in the same way that Christianity has gotten away from its Old Testament roots and is now kind of a softer, kinder, loving version of the Christian religion. They've done the same thing, but just in a shorter time span.
So at its founding, though, LDS had these tenets.
These tenets. One was polygamy. One was the law of consecration, and another one was blood atonement.
Okay, so let's talk about So polygamy, I think people know, is multiple wives.
Correct.
Well, and what I didn't know is you had said that was enshrined in the original LDS doctrine as required. It had to be practiced. It would never stop being practiced. It would be for all eternity until Jesus came back. But they've moved away from that. And you said for basically political reasons?
That's my interpretation of it. This history is not like for scholars. Scholars of Mormon and U.S. history are going to probably find flaws and stuff, but I just want to give your listeners a general idea, a really general overview of how my dad's cult came into being and where they got their doctrine from and that sort of thing. And if you read Joseph Smith and Brigham Young's teachings in the Doctrine and Covenants, the Pearl of Great Price, the teachings of the Prophet Joseph Smith, which is colloquially referred to as the TPJS, things like that, early Mormon doctrine, they said the gospel was being restored to the earth by Joseph Smith, and the priesthood authority of the church was being restored to the earth and would never be removed from the earth again. And these practices, particularly polygamy, was a requirement that you live polygamy in order to be saved in the highest level of heaven. Essentially, there was 3 levels of heaven in the Mormon dogma, which is telestial, terrestrial, and celestial. And in order to be saved in the highest level, you had to live polygamy, and polygamy would never be taken off the earth, and the priesthood would never be taken off the earth again. Many mainstream Mormon people don't even know this doctrine because the LDS Church has moved away from it quite strongly. But they were tenets of their early founding, particularly Joseph Smith and Brigham Young. So polygamy was one, and blood atonement was another one, which basically blood atonement, one version of it, there's people that believe different variations of it, but one is that if you became on this earth a celestial being and that you were going to be saved into the celestial kingdom after you died, and then denied that and left the church, that after you died, you would be sent to outer darkness, which is essentially worse than hell. So there's the 3 levels of heaven, and there's hell, and then there's another thing that's even worse than that, which is outer darkness. And the only way that you could save yourself, get back into the celestial kingdom after you died, is by having your blood spilt. And so what they taught is essentially you were doing that person a favor by killing them.
Capital punishment
Yes.
for leaving
Yes.
the church and ordered.
Yes. The way I see it is it's backdoor saying, like, you're going to give away our secrets, so we need to make sure you die. But that's not the way it was taught. It was taught as like, we're doing you a favor. And that was early Mormon doctrine, early LDS doctrine. Most people aren't aware of that.
And then just so we touch on the third one and make sure
Yep.
people know, consecration is sort of an extreme version of tithing.
Essentially, the telestial level, you're required to tithe 10% of your income to the church. I don't know what the terrestrial level did. We didn't talk about that really much when I was growing up. But the celestial level is you lived the law of consecration, where you gave all your property to the church. You gave everything to the church for the betterment of God's kingdom. And so you didn't own anything. The church owned everything, your property down to your clothes. I mean, like you didn't own anything. And so my dad was trying to get back to that, where people lived that law, and essentially it's a way of getting power. You do what you're told, you do what the person in charge tells you, and they distribute the money and the assets how they see fit.
So basically, you had talked about, so your grandfather actually kind of started this initial cult, where
Yes.
the families went down to Mexico, which was commonplace when Utah was becoming a state, and then later when Mormons that were practicing the original practices felt like they were being, treated ill. They moved down to Mexico, and you said that he was basically kind of a loving, caring, or seemed to be a loving, caring character. But then your father and his brother came along, and his brother was the prophet of God in this new religion, was the prophet that was, kind of bringing people back to the new ways, or how would you explain it?
So when the LDS Church stopped practicing polygamy, there was already a lot of people that practiced polygamy that were already doing it. So they were kind of they didn't want to stop. They were ordered to stop doing that, but they didn't want to. So a few went to Canada, where the polygamy wasn't outlawed, or maybe it was, but they didn't prosecute it. So a bunch of them just went underground in the United States, and then another big group of them went to Mexico. A bunch of different groups, just little family groups essentially, went to Mexico, where polygamy wasn't legal per se, but it wasn't prosecuted. So, and my grandfather's claim was that the LDS Church, the mainstream Mormon Church, was the one that was actually in apostasy, and he actually was the prophet leading the church, keeping the priesthood and these covenants, primarily polygamy, alive, because Joseph Smith had said it would never again be taken off the earth until Jesus came. So they lived in abject poverty down there, but it wasn't the blood atonement stuff wasn't happening or anything like that. It was just kind of just wayward little group of a family living what they thought was true.
And
gospel.
Mexico didn't interfere with polygamy the way the United States would try to.
No.
It wasn't against the law there.
Yeah, I mean, Mexico was pretty Wild West in some degree. They didn't prosecute a lot of stuff. If you weren't causing problems, they didn't care.
So things changed after your grandfather died, and I guess your Uncle Joel and your father, Ervil, were now sort of the top.
Yes.
So this story is told in great detail, and it spans decades in Daughters of the Cult. And we
Yes.
won't have time to go through every
Yes.
detail of this, although I will say it is an unbelievable story, and to understand everything that happened and the murders and the multi-state all that stuff. But if you could just sort of give us some of the highlights of what happened and how your childhood unfolded.
My understanding is that my dad was fairly intelligent and a scholar of the scriptures. And at some point, and he was also pretty driven, he wanted to be the top guy, and he wasn't. So he got really deep into the scriptures and realized that it wasn't just polygamy that wasn't being lived by the LDS people or this organization he was part of. There was a lot of other parts of it. That's when the blood atonement and the law of consecration and all this other stuff came up. And so my dad decided to have his brother murdered so that he could be the head guy, the patriarch of the cult.
So for clarity, he used the law of blood atonement to
Yes.
say, "Oh, he has actually strayed from
He's
the
a
way.
false prophet.
We have to save his soul.
Yes.
If he's killed and I take over, we can save him and save ourselves."
Correct. And he just assumed that everybody was then going to follow him, which didn't happen. A few, maybe 100 people followed him, and the rest didn't. So he started kind of a campaign for terrorizing them in order to get them to submit themselves to him. And it was him, along with his right-hand man at that time, Dan Jordan, who started this campaign. Dan Jordan was one of the people that actually murdered Joel, my dad's brother Joel, for my dad. So they did, there's a raid they did on Los Molinos where they drove through town and firebombed houses. And as people were running out, they're just shooting people from the back of a truck. And I should point out, too, that the people that actually were doing this were basically children. Just my dad's children, who were most of them teenagers, but my dad had told them to do it and ordered them to do it, so they did.
And just so people have a sense of where you come in, I don't remember exactly how many wives he had or how many children, but it was a lot.
It was a lot, depending on who counts. I've always had 13 wives and 56 kids, but now we find out there's actually one other wife that he had for a little while that I never knew of before, so 14 wives. The number of children is kind of up to debate. Some people, we just say over 50 to make it simple.
And you're among the younger
Yes.
of his children.
I was very fortunate in some ways to come along a lot later. All the stuff that I've so far mentioned happened before I was even born. I wasn't part of any of that. But getting on, progressing with the story, my dad, at that point, the Mexican authorities were after my dad. He started killing people in the United States too. So the FBI, he was on the FBI's most wanted list for a while. A lot of stuff happened in there that you can watch the documentary or read several of the books, including my sister's book, Daughters of the Cult. Not Daughters of the Cult.
The Polygamous
The Polygamous Daughter, yes. To get more details about that than the chronology. But at some point, my dad was finally caught in Mexico, and he was trying to overthrow the Mexican government. He thought he was going to overthrow the Catholic Church in Mexico, and Mormonism was going to become the dominant religion there, and he was basically going to be not running the government, but telling them what to do, is how he saw it. He had very ambitious goals. Finally, but every time he would get caught, he would, judges would get murdered, witnesses would get murdered, whatever. A lot of stuff happened. People would get bribed, judges get bribed, whatever. And so he was getting away without really getting punished for these things he was doing. And they finally got so tired of him that they handed him over to the United States, even though we didn't have any extradition treaties with Mexico at the time. They'd still handed him over, we're done with this guy, do something with him. And the FBI wanted him too, so they took him and prosecuted him. He went to prison, and then he died in prison when I was 9 years old.
Okay, so did you ever meet him?
I lived with my dad in the same house, actually an apartment, for a few months of my life. I didn't know him very well. The little interaction, 3 or 4 interactions I had with him, he was nice to me. He seemed like a kind person. He never did any of the killings himself. He just ordered them done in the name of the religion. But we played with him. He had this thing he used to do with all of his kids when he was around them, where he'd put us on his back and he would bend over kind of 45 degrees, and then with your back on his, and then he'd kind of wiggle, and you'd slide down his back like a slide, and you kind of feel like you're wiggling around, going to fall off his back, because he was a very large man. So as a little child, when I was 5, 6 years old, when I knew him, it was a real fun little game. And I remember him, the few interactions I had with him, but I didn't call him Dad. I vaguely knew he was my dad, but I called him T.O., which at that time I thought his initials were T.O. I thought that's what I was calling him, but I was actually calling him Tío, which is uncle in Spanish. And because I lived in Mexico for a while, I do speak a little bit of Spanish, But at the time, I didn't know what Theo meant. I didn't realize I was calling him uncle. And that was just, growing up, we always had different words for different things so that people overhearing conversations, or if the police are asking you a question or whatever, you wouldn't reveal too much information. So if police are there and I say Theo, they're gonna be like, oh, uncle, he's not the dad. We're always like these. We always had different words for codes for everything, so that you wouldn't give away too much information on accident as a kid.
I was going to say, that's really interesting. We talk about like subcultures, because in prison, there are kind of nicknames or other words for everybody, even within the gangs or within different units, so that if somebody had to say something, it wouldn't necessarily be understood either by a rival group or by the people in authority. So very similar experience. We
had codes for how you use telephones. Like on Sunday was nobody worked. It was devoted to church. I'm just going to say church, but it was meeting in someone's house and being taught stuff from scriptures. But it was devoted to church, so we didn't do any work. But because the business that the family ran was mostly over the telephone, if you wanted to get a hold of somebody, you had to call the place, let the phone ring once, hang up, call again, let it ring once, hang up, call and let it ring 3 times, hang up, and then call again, and then just let it ring, and then somebody would answer it, because the code was like, oh, that's somebody from the inside the group.
Interesting. Okay, so that was, so all this sort of secret communication, things to keep you separate and separated from the outside
society.
World.
We weren't allowed to call our brothers and sisters. My mom's children I called brother and sister, but any of my other siblings I had to call them cousins. So people wouldn't, you can't have 7 siblings that are the same age or a few months apart, and they're all, that's my brother. That's my sister. Like, how can you have 7 people that are a few months apart in age? That doesn't work in normal society. So we had to say cousins. Everything we did had codes and ways of avoiding detection and stuff.
So, I mean, I guess your childhood is spent. Your father is in prison. He does some writing, which comes in later because his followers or his people that come after him start using his writings as sort of a guide. But you end up living in various places under various prophets that succeed after your father's death.
So after my father went to prison, the cult kind of broke into like 3 different groups, main groups. One was what I later learned was referred to as the KOG, or Kingdom of God. And that was some of my dad's other children and some of his other followers, and they mostly operated out of Mexico. And then there was a group in Houston, Texas, that was basically led by Mark Schnoth. And then there was another group in Denver, Colorado, and we just called the Denver group and the Houston group, or the time, because I was in 2 of those at different times. But even during that time, my whole childhood was characterized by just instability, just moving all the time. I was born when my dad was already on the run. So it was, we just moved all the time. We were constantly trying to stay ahead of the FBI or local law enforcement. We were always doing, let's just say it was just moving all the time. And so I've lived in various places, various houses in the same city, different cities. And I spent a little bit of time under Mark Schnoth in Houston, and I spent a lot of time under Dan Jordan in Colorado.
So, I mean, there was the paranoia of the law enforcement potential, but then also later the paranoia of these assassination plots, right, for various people who were on a hit list that your dad had made for the blood atonement. And so that also created fear and paranoia that permeated the different groups.
Yes. My dad had a lot of people murdered up that time, so murdering was fairly commonplace. I didn't know about this, or I knew very little about it. Just little pieces would come out as time. And as an adult, I actually read a book about my family that had been published, and that's when a lot of the pieces started coming together for me. I believe it was Prophet of Blood. But I didn't know most of that information. I didn't know all the people that had been murdered. I was basically surviving as a child. I didn't know what was going on. But I forgot your question now.
Oh, just I guess just that the paranoia was coming from the assassination plots and law enforcement.
Yes.
And I mean, there were these shootings that happened when kids were present. People were killed on a camping trip. Dan Jordan was killed on a camping trip. And I mean, we don't have to get into any one specific incident, but just that's the sort of level of stuff that you were dealing with as a kid.
I actually didn't know about most of the killings up until Dan Jordan was murdered, really. My paranoia was mostly from law enforcement or other authorities of different types. We weren't allowed to have friends at school because we didn't want people learning about what we were doing. We weren't allowed to participate in any extracurricular activities. I also didn't want to have friends because there came a point where I knew, like, oh, we're weird, we're different. I didn't want people. I had that angst of a child being like, I don't want to have to tell somebody about, like, this is my family. Like, I didn't like my family. I didn't like this religion we were in. Like, I didn't like being part of it. I didn't want to tell anybody about it. So it was enforced basically by, one, you're not supposed to tell anybody, so don't. And then two, by, like, I didn't want anybody to know about my family, so I didn't have friends from school. We just had such a massive family that you had your own built-in friend group inside of our organization.
You talked about going to school and education. You and your sisters, as we talked about before, are very educated. But education wasn't necessarily a central tenet to the religion. In fact, it seemed to be kind of the antithesis. So you went to school up until, what, 8th grade? And then what happened?
I did complete 8th grade, and then I was required to go preach because at that point, Dan Jordan had started a mission field, essentially. I lived in Denver at the time, and he had started a mission field trying to essentially convert LDS people to this more fundamentalist version of Mormonism. And so I was made to go do that. And I didn't really believe in this doctrine, but I didn't really know how to, you couldn't say no, really. I confided in one of my cousins that I didn't really want to go do this mission field. I was 15 at the time. And I didn't really want to go do it. And I didn't even say I don't believe in this doctrine. I just was very cautious, like, I don't want to do this, kind of quietly. And somehow that information got around, and one of my sisters who was married to Dan Jordan, she was much older than me, she came and read me the riot act about how I need to exercise my faith and I need to get right, and just chewed me out viciously, and then told me there's no choice. You're going to do this. And so I went and did it. Over the summer after 8th grade. And then when the school year started again, there was really just no talk of, like, oh, you're going to go back and go to school again. It was just like, no, you're just going to keep doing this. So school was done for me at that point. And I just kept doing this mission field thing where we were required to go without purse or script, which was an old Mormon practice of, you don't take any money. You don't have anything other than your scriptures and a change of clothes, and you go and knock on doors and rely on people to let you stay with them, or give you a little bit of money to get a hotel room, or whatever. You don't take any money. You just go 24/7. Your job is preaching the gospel. And I never really believed in this doctrine, so, like, I was really torn. Like, I didn't do a very good job. Like, there was, and you went with different people at different times. And, like, there was a period of time where I went with one of my older brothers, and he was very devout. He was like 100% in, and it was very embarrassing to go with him because he was just so adamant, and he probably had possibly some mental health issues or two. But you'd knock on a door and you'd start telling people, "Hey, we're from the Church of Jesus Christ," which was the name of the church when I was in the mission field, which was kind of a way of sort of being tricky, and and we dressed similar to Latter-day Saint missionaries and had the similar look. So people would think, oh, they're from our church. Let's let them in and talk to them. And so you kind of get a little bit of an in that way by calling it the Church of Jesus Christ, but not of Latter-day Saints. But anyway, we'd get in. But a lot of people were like, yeah, I'm busy. I don't want to talk to you. So they would be like, no, thank you, and just start shutting their door. And he would, like, jam his foot in the door and just adamantly, like, very adamant, like, no, this is for your soul. You need to listen to me. And I'm just like, oh my God, we're going to get arrested. Like, somebody's going to call the police on us. You cannot be this pushing. Like, he's trying to push the door back open and, like, force people to let him in because he just believed so much that it was the right thing to do.
And probably saving them.
Yes. And I did not believe that. So other times I would get paired with other people that I also knew didn't believe it. Then we would not go. We would just hang out at a apartment complex that we knew that had a rec area in their office building in the upstairs that they didn't keep locked. And so we would go in the back, go upstairs, sleep, watch TV, play pool, foosball, whatever, and just spend the day there. And then when the day was over, we would head back to the, this was at a period where we weren't doing Always Without Purse or Script. So we'd head back during the day or at the evening and kind of do a debrief of, like, who we'd talked to, what doors we'd knocked on. And we'd just make up our story, like, we're going to say this.
Yeah. Something
Something that's not a lot, but something believable. And we'd tell our debrief, and then we'd go back to the mission house and then come out the next day and go right back to the same place.
So
It just sounds like your entire childhood up to this point has been neglect and abuse and scarcity and literally being hungry and
Yes.
not knowing where you're going to get things.
Yeah, we got most of our food out of trash dumpsters behind grocery stores for many years. A little bit of welfare sometimes. We'd go on welfare and have food stamps. But like somebody that, like say my mom would get on food stamps, she wasn't only raising her children, she was also raising 3 or 4 other wives' children in the same house. So that's really not enough. So we would dumpster dive behind grocery stores back before they would lock their dumpsters. And we'd just jump in and find stuff that was still edible, even though it was been thrown away. Like a loaf of bread that's expired that, you know, has mold on one end or the other, but most of the loaf doesn't have any mold. Or moldy cheese was a common one. Like starts turning green on the outside, but you can chop all that off, and the rest of the cheese is mold essentially, so you can still eat it. And that's how we lived most of our life. But there was periods of time where there's no adults around and nobody to drive you anywhere to try to do dumpster diving. So we would eat weeds out of the yard, you know, which ones were just to have something in your belly because you hadn't eaten for days on end. And these ones are like, we know these ones aren't poisonous. One's purslane. I ate a lot of purslane growing up. We called it the Mexican name, which we called it verde larga, but the English name for it is purslane. I ate a lot of that. And we had these other ones that I don't even know what they are, but they had like these little, we called them little cheeses because they look like little Baby Bell cheese, and you unpeel them and there's a little kind of nut sort of thing in there, and just get a little handful of those just to have something in your stomach to sustain you until somebody could get some more food in the house. So it was a lot of starvation and privation.
And those periods of either overbearing, over control,
Yes.
or no supervision and utter neglect,
Yes.
and really abandonment, sort of alternating.
Alternating constantly throughout my childhood till I was 15 years old. Just abuse and overbearing, religiosity and control to nothing, just Lord of the Flies, violence amongst children. We were taught to be violent. Like if you said, "Oh, he took my toy" or whatever, like, oh, go kick his ass. You know, like that's whoever wielded the most power would win, essentially. And it was a lot of violence.
Was there, being a boy, I mean, there was obviously a difference in terms of the roles prescribed in a fundamentalist religion, but do you feel like you had different treatment or a different experience than your sisters?
Yes, but in some ways not dramatically different. So like one of my primary jobs that I did for a lot of years was what we called pickups, because we always ran some sort of an appliance reconditioning business for income. That's what we did. And you'd put an ad in. The Craigslist of the time was like the Thrifty Nickel or a newspaper ad or something saying, we'll buy your old appliances off you, or we'll haul away your junk appliances if you don't want them. And so somebody buy a new washer or a new fridge and they have this old one they want to get rid of. We'd come along and pay them $5 for it or something. And then we'd take that and then try to refurbish it, recondition it, and then sell it. These were usually clandestine operations, but always operated by slave labor of those wives and children.
So they were experiencing that, but you were experiencing that. And in this kind of culture of violence, how did you reconcile? Because you basically talked about knowing that you didn't believe the religion. You know you didn't believe this. How did you reconcile all the violence around you and then what you might see out in the world, or this kind of like different culture that was clearly so alien from your own?
It's a really tough thing to explain, because even though I didn't believe the religion, I somehow believed that I was wrong for not believing it. And it's a weird dichotomy because that's all I'd been taught my whole life. It has been just pounded into us my entire life, like relentlessly, that my dad was a prophet and that he was God's chosen person to lead the church and hold the priesthood, the highest priesthood authority ever, until Jesus came, or whoever he passed it on to. So I somehow still believed I was the wrong one for not believing it. I never really believed it. I was miserable my entire childhood, mostly because this oppression, this abuse, and it's hard to reconcile. It's difficult to reconcile, and I tried periods of time where no, you're wrong, so you need to try to believe. And I'd go for periods of time where I'm trying really hard to believe, and I'm trying really hard to pray and get some sort of, we were taught that if you pray, you will get a revelation, or you will get a burning in your bosom that tells you the truth of this and stuff. And there were periods where I tried really hard, but I never felt anything. I never heard anything. I just didn't believe it. But I also somehow, at the same time, had believed that I was wrong for not believing, but I still wanted out. I did not want to be a part of this. So it's a weird dichotomy to have to try to live with. And I forgot where we were.
Well, I wanted to ask, because you were talking about the guilt and the struggles of childhood. There was a period down in Mexico where you answered the door, and you said that you carried this like tremendous guilt from that moment that you couldn't have possibly imagined.
Yeah, that was. I always thought that when I answered that door, that my dad was in the house. Because one thing that's hard to explain is that we never knew who was going to be in the house at any given time. That was a time where my dad regularly lived in that house at the same time, but adults came and went, children came and went. Like it was. You never knew who was going to really be there. There was no stability. You didn't know if you were going to be there. Like somebody told you to go somewhere else, you just did. Or somebody took you somewhere else, you just did. You just went. So I thought he was there. I never realized that at the same time they were doing the Mexican authorities were doing a raid at another place where he was actually caught. So in my mind, when I answered that door and then my dad was caught, that was my fault.
And to be clear, you answered the door and the federales were on the other side,
yes.
executing a search warrant or looking for people.
They were beating on the door.
And they took one of your sisters at that point?
Yes, they took one of my sisters and one of my dad's wives. They arrested a lot of people. I was 5 or 6 years old at the time, so I don't remember all the specific details, but I do remember the general feeling of it, and I do remember thinking, I'm the one that opened this door, so therefore I'm responsible for the prophet of God getting arrested and sent to prison. And just carried that around as like, I must be evil somehow. Like, how could the devil let me do that? Or so whatever the thing is, I couldn't really put it into words, but I still felt I was guilty for that.
And that sounds like the same kind of internalizing that you did around, I don't believe, I must be wrong.
Yes.
I opened the door. Now the
I
prophet,
must be wrong.
I am wrong. I am actually the bad one
Yes.
here. And so this sort of internalizing sense of shame and
Yes.
guilt.
And I don't know how it came about, but one time I was talking to one of my cousins, he's not really a cousin. He's one of Dan Jordan's children, but we just called him cousins. So that's still cousin through marriage, I guess. And I was telling him, like, I for some reason decided to open up about this thing because the conversation kind of went that way. Like, yeah, I'm the one that opened this door. And so I'm the one that actually got my dad. And this was before I had formalized the thought in my mind that this cult was bullshit, that I knew I didn't believe it. I was still kind of in that where I kind of still thought I was wrong for not believing it. And I told him the story and like all this guilt I had carried around with me. And to his credit, he was just like flabbergasted. If I told you that story, you'd just be like, what are you talking about? But I still carried it as that child. So I just carried it with me the whole time with the same narrative. As I grew and got older, if somebody told me that story, I would have thought it was ridiculous. But at that age, I still carried it with the original narrative. So I told him the story, and he was just like very adamant. You have to know. You have to think about this. You are not guilty of anything. The adults were wrong in that situation. You should have never been put in that position. You were like, he just kind of grabbed me like repeatedly, like, you need to understand this. And it kind of like, oh.
So how
right.
old, that was, when
I was
was that?
Probably 18, maybe 17.
Okay, so that's like it's years later that you've been carrying that, and then finally somebody starts to say, wait a second. No.
Yeah.
So I think that was down in Mexico, but your later years when you were forced to leave school after 8th grade, and then there was the murder of Dan Jordan, who'd become the new prophet after your father's death.
Yes.
And then there was his murder. Then there was this infamous set of assassinations of several other people that are known as the 4 o'clock murders that made news around the country. And at that time, everything was sort of dissolving, right? Like, I mean, the cult was.
Yes.
And so I'm interested how you extricated or what happened to you as the cult dissolved.
It's a long process, and it happens in like fits and starts. It took several years for me to just be able to, after Dan Jordan was murdered, to just be able to say he was not a prophet. He was not a patriarch. This was a cult. My dad was insane. None of this was true. To be able to just say it clearly like that. I mean, like the thoughts came to my head and like I kind of would sit with it for a while, but it took years for it to finally coalesce and say like, okay, that was wrong. That was a cult. Like none of that stuff that was taught was from God. It was just all garbage. And I just worked on myself for a decade after that of like, I had the opportunity at that point to decide, what do I believe? Who do I want to be? And it was just unraveling all the brainwashing. And we were raised a lot of very homophobic, I mean, like extreme, like homosexuals should be stoned to death, was what we were taught. They were immoral, and it was a detriment to society. And we were racist, white supremacist, you'd say, even though we didn't associate with like skinhead type white supremacists. We still believed black people cannot hold the priesthood. That's what we were taught. So they were just a lesser race because Cain killed Abel. So I had to like decide, do I believe that?
And how do you go about, like, when you're talking about like dismantling or re-examining, I mean, is that happening in a vacuum? Is it reading? Is it talking to other people? How does that begin to happen?
So again, a big process, but many times it was unconscious, like some ways unconscious. Like the thing that was really big for me when I was about maybe 9 years old, to back up, like I was a very kind of scared and timid child growing up. And one thing I was deathly afraid of was I was scared of the dark. Like you can't even imagine the terror that would just grip me if it was dark, if I couldn't see very well. And you'd be laying in bed and you wake up at night and you look out and you see a chair with something on it and it's like, that's a monster. And I would just grit my teeth and just like try to fall back asleep because I was just petrified of the dark. And one time I had this experience where we were playing hide and seek. And because most of our playing time had to be indoors because there's so many kids living in these houses that if you had 30 kids every day, 20 kids out in the yard playing all day, the neighbors are going to be like, what, something's weird going on there. And it brings attention. So we mostly had to play like indoors. So we're playing hide and seek, and I went in a closet in this house. And it's one of those closets that had the pull chain light. And I was smart enough to realize that the person seeking is going to see the light under the door if I leave it on. So I need to turn this light off so they won't suspect someone's in here. So I turned off the light, and it was immediate, like just terror. Like I was just crippling terror, and I just clicked the light back on. And it was weird to me, like intellectually, that as soon as the light's back on, I was zero fear. I can see that this is a coat, this is a box, this is a vacuum is in here, whatever it is. No fear. So I click it back off again, and like I started just playing with that. Like, this is interesting to me. Why am I scared when it's dark and not when it's light? And slowly played with that. And also it was a little bit of an adrenaline rush, like the fear, like how long can I hold with this fear and this adrenaline and then click the light back on. So I ended up doing that, and it became a fun game where I would just do it regularly for months and months on end. And I noticed I was going longer and longer in the dark that I could withstand. So finally one day it came to a point where I clicked the light off, and the dark had lost its power. There was I didn't have fear anymore. I was like, I didn't understand that I was conditioning myself to not be, I was doing it as a game. So I didn't understand it, but later it became like, thinking back, like you can control something about your mind. There is something about your brain, your psychology that you do have some control over. And your thoughts and your reactions to things. And also I was, to the extent that you can be spoiled as a child in this cult, I was kind of like a mama's boy. And so whenever I would get hurt, I was very dramatic, crying, everything has to stop. I want to be the center of attention. And it got old pretty fast. The other siblings would be like, you're not injured, we're going on. But I was crying more because now I want more attention and like nobody's giving it to me. But then there came a point where I realized in my own head, I smashed my finger really bad. A big piece of wood had fell in the garage and smashed my finger. And to the point where later it got black and blue and the fingernail fell off. But nobody was really giving me attention. And I wanted to keep playing too, I realized. So while I'm sitting here suffering and crying, I'm not having fun. So can I control this pain and ignore it? And just at what point, for a little moment, it's too painful. But as it starts subsiding, it's like, at this point now I can ignore it and I can just go back to playing and just stop thinking about it, push it down, go have fun because we're doing something that's enjoyable. And so I just kind of became tougher and stronger and learned how to just kind of these little lessons that came to me as like, you can control something about your own mind, your own thoughts, the way you react to things. At the time, I wasn't really conscious of it, but thinking back later, I realized these realizations kind of would come to me and help me realize that like, I can also control what I believe about people, about religion, about myself. And so I started working on that. Like, instead of having it kind of happen by accident, kind of actively take a little charge of it. Like one example is I started listening to this radio show called Savage Love, hosted by Dan Savage. Mm-hmm. And at first, I was just a young, libidinous youth, and I thought it would be titillating to just listen to this person talk about sex. And as I listened to his radio, this radio program, it started dawning on me that what he's talking about is like, homosexuals aren't evil. They're just like everybody else. I came to the realization, it took time to realize it, but I realized that sex isn't an arbiter of someone's morality, like I had been taught. If you have sex outside of wedlock, you're evil, and certain things need to happen as punishment for that. Just a lot of super extreme purity culture. And I kind of worked through that and said, like, that's actually wrong. Some people can have sex and it changes their morality, nothing. Like there are hazards with sex. Emotionally, it's just a huge emotional event. If you're too young to handle that, like that's bad. It can be bad. Pregnancy, diseases, there are reasons why you don't want to be promiscuous. But even if you are, it doesn't change your value as a human being, which is what I had taught. So what I'd been taught.
And you had said this earlier. You were basically de-radicalized by Dan Savage in his radio show.
Yes.
And that's amazing.
I think that is amazing. I think he's sort of legendary. We ran his column in a paper that I worked for years, and it provoked outrage, even in a relatively liberal community, because it's pretty out there.
Pretty
but
graphic.
for somebody coming out of a fundamentalist cult, that would certainly be eye-opening.
Yeah. Oh, it was very extreme for me, but it was also, like I said, it was titillating. So that was my initial reason for listening. But then I realized, like, oh no, I'm actually getting de-radicalized. I'm getting an education here, and then it kind of made me, driving around all day doing pickups or working in people's houses on appliances or whatever. You meet a lot of different people, and I met people that were gay and are homosexual, and it was surprising to me that I thought these were people that were going to hell in this cult that I used to be in. And now I'm meeting them and they're just the nicest people I've ever met. Is like, these people treat me better than my own family, my own cult, like, who abused me and told me I was worthless. And I was always a little bit of a black sheep in my family, because not from my siblings per se, but from cousins. And I was treated even worse in some ways because I was kind of obnoxious and loud and had a ton of energy and various reasons. But these people are treating me well. And it was just like cemented in my mind, like, that's garbage. That concept that I was taught, I have to now reject it and embrace people that are different in that way from me. And it was amazing. They were just like, these people are beautiful. These people are value as human beings. It was like such a revelation to my brain. Like, oh, these people are awesome. And people are not, I don't judge people based on their sexual preferences and proclivities. I base them on how they treat people, what they do in their life, other things.
Yeah, and Jesse, you've talked about this in terms of your experience in prison and seeing people have their minds opened simply by the exposure. If you live in a silo, I mean, I won't take that. Yeah.
One of the really interesting things about prison is it's kind of forced integration. You're around people that you, from different socioeconomic backgrounds or religions or races, that you wouldn't necessarily live around on the street, and you're forced to interact on a daily basis, to eat together, to sell together, to do whatever. And what I saw it change a lot of people's minds. Especially, you would get these really like kind of racist guys from like Southwest Virginia who grew up and they were taught all these things, and then all of a sudden they're like, I kind of like these guys. Like, maybe this isn't so bad. And
yes.
I remember we had this one really charismatic gay guy who was like the most outgoing, effeminate, and everybody liked him. And there were a lot of guys that it messed with their minds because they're like, wait, I don't think I'm supposed to like him, but I kind of do. And should I feel bad? That kind of internalized guilt.
Yes.
So it was really interesting to see just literally proximity. And Brian Stevenson, who's a big activist and a religious guy himself, he says the solution is proximity. Like, we don't solve anything from being separate. We don't solve anything from being away. We solve it by being together and interacting and disagreeing and arguing and then having fun or playing cards, but just by being close to each other.
And I ended up, like, one of the worst insults you could call somebody was gay in how I was growing up. Like, if you really wanted to insult me, that's the slur you used. And it came later to where I'd be like, I don't take that as an insult. I take that as a compliment. If you use the F word and say, you homo or you queer or whatever, and I'm like, thank you. Like, these are the best people I've ever met in my life. They've treated me way better than anybody in this cult ever did. So I've never met a single homosexual that was not just the most wonderful. I mean, I'm sure there's horrible people out there too, and all sexual identities and races and religions and creeds, but I've never met one.
But right, they're their quality as a person has nothing to do with their
Nothing to do with their
sexuality. It has to do with
sexuality.
their behaviors and
Yes.
choices.
Yes.
But so it's kind of hard because you're trying to like develop these new mindsets and new understandings, new perspectives, but you don't really separate clearly from the cult. Because even when Dan Jordan is killed, and you guys you're talking about just sitting around trying to figure out where to go to run next time, you just point at a map and you end up in Oregon with no plan or no position. But then you continue to work with somebody from the Jordan family for years and years. Like,
Now, to be fair, he had basically disavowed his own father's teachings as well, and wasn't religious. But so I didn't associate with him as a religious aspect. It was more of just like I needed a job and a career, and he was doing something that I could work for him, and it was business and family essentially. But it had nothing to do with religion. We didn't talk about religion. We didn't do anything religious. Like, it was just business, and we hang out. We were friends and stuff, but it was not.
And at that point, I mean, in terms of your education, where did that end? And you've now gone back to school, but
Yes.
like from the time you're 17. I mean, did you graduate from high school?
I did not graduate from high school. After Dan Jordan was murdered, about 2 to 3 months of the my ninth grade school year had already passed, because I was forced to stay and do the mission field preaching. But after he was murdered, I went back to Colorado from Utah and started ninth grade 3 months late. And it was extremely difficult to be starting that late in the school year, on top of my spotty education up to that point, because we moved so much that you go to one school that is teaching something that you've already learned somewhere else, and every school is like slightly different. So my education up to that point had already been so spotty that I was already behind. But when they tested me to determine where to put me in the school, I tested well enough that they put me in a lot of hard classes. Mm-hmm. So instead of doing algebra again, because I'd already done algebra in 2 other schools, they didn't have anywhere in geometry to put me, so they put me in trigonometry. And I was always fascinated with Russia was a big news story at the time with the Cold War and stuff. So I wanted to learn Russian, so I took a Russian class, and it was just too much. Nobody was making me go to school, and it was overwhelming. And in addition to that, I was a pretty hard worker, and I was pretty pivotal in our family business, and we were essentially in poverty. So I dropped out at that point after like going for another 2 months of ninth grade, and just went and started working. And then it was shortly after that the 4 o'clock murders happened. We tried to sneak out in the middle of the night because we were worried we were going to next on the hit list. My mom was on the hit list, and several other people. So we moved as far away as we could to Oregon, and I regretted my decision not to finish high school. So at that point, I decided to get a GED. So I went and took the GED and passed. And now I'm in the military. I am taking college classes, and I am 76 credit hours into a 120 credit hour bachelor's degree in management.
As you're going through this and you're separating, we talked a lot about that scarcity and the things you existed in childhood. I wanted to talk about how some of those things manifest today, or the things that remain. We had breakfast before we did this, and we were talking about it. And I said, we have kind of similar experience. I said, like, is it hard for you to leave food on the plate? And that was just a really simple example of all the ways that this trauma comes up.
Yeah. I still have a lot of weird peccadillos and idiosyncrasies and stuff from the trauma. They're not as strong as they used to be, but there's a lot of them. Like the food anxiety is one. I didn't know it was food anxiety. I just knew, like, I hate to cook. Cooking is very stressful for me because I'm already hungry, and I start cooking, and my brain is just like, just eat the food. So you're not gonna have enough food. Just eat. Like, I just get a lot of stress of, like, if I'm gonna cook, I have to cook something very simple. Fry some eggs, put them on a piece of toast, and eat. Like, very quick. It's just so stressful for me that it's not as bad as it used to be, but it is still there. Like, it still exists a little bit. And then also another way it kind of rears its head is I hate seeing someone near me go hungry. So it's kind of weird, but like at work, somebody's like, oh, I forgot my lunch. And it just stresses me out to realize, oh, that person's going to be hungry. I cannot let that person be hungry. I have to, have some of my food. And like, let me go buy you something. Like, whatever I have to do to make sure somebody around me doesn't go hungry is, it's not as bad. And it used to be really bad, but now I can kind of manage it a lot easier now. And as I've gone through my life, kind of deprogramming myself and trying to help myself overcome traumas and stuff. There's some that are like, I'll get a little bit of gain by, I could go get some therapy and do some EMDR or some other, form of therapy and maybe overcome this, but it doesn't really cause enough of a problem for me to put in the effort, because I spent so many years without therapy, just trying on my own to figure out ways to overcome my own issues. And that's not a big problem. It's there and exists. It's fading. It's not as bad as it used to be. So I just kind of live with that one. It's also really difficult for me to throw stuff away. This is embarrassing to say, but like there was one time when I was in my early 20s where I rented a house from my nephew. And when I moved out, there was a certain items of like clothing and shoes and just various things that I cleaned the place and tried to leave it in good condition when I moved out, but I could not bring myself to throw these bags of stuff in the trash, even though they were so worn that they weren't really useful to donate to a charity or anything. But it was still, there's some value left in them. There's some use that could be gotten out of them that I could not throw them away. And he teased me later about like, what was the trash bags of stuff left in my house? And like, I'm so sorry, but I could not bring myself to throw those away. And he's like, well, I just had to throw them away. And I'm like, again, I'm very sorry about that. So it's not as bad now. I can throw things away, but I do have to generally tell myself it's okay. I've never lacked for food or anything I wanted to buy ever since that time when Dan Jordan was murdered, essentially. I've never lacked for anything. I've always had this very strong drive to earn money and get money somehow, always live below my means. I've always had money to buy whatever I wanted pretty much since then. And so I have to remind myself, it's okay. You can these shoes that you've worn, they were your nice shoes, and they became your not as nice shoes, and then they became your lawn mowing shoes, and now they're just worn. There's nothing left. It's okay to throw them away, and just I can do it. It's not as big of a problem. But for the most part, we were actually taught that psychiatry and therapy and that sort of thing was satanic.
Have you gone to therapy?
Yes, I have. To be fair, I've gone years ago to therapy, but I just knew like I have to have things wrong with me. Growing up like that, like I know I'm messed up somehow, but I had a good life. Like I was successful and functioning in society. I didn't have any big. I wasn't having flashbacks or nightmares or. I was functioning well, but I was still just like, this is prophylactic. I think it's a good idea to go and just start working things out to help fix stuff that the therapist can tell me what I need to work on. And it really doesn't work like that. You can't just go and say, okay, I need help, fix me. They're like, well, what do you want to work on? And I didn't understand that. I just like, I don't know. You help me figure it out. I came from this, so I have to have problems. But I couldn't see my own issues because I'm doing well, not from all appearances.
I have a question about the relationships with your siblings that are really on display in the docuseries that's streaming on Hulu, Daughters of the Cult. And it looks, the way it is presented, and I know it's not all of your siblings, but the Anna and Celia are two of the sort of the main protagonists in that series. And it looks to me like you're all very supportive of each other. I know there were times during your childhood you were separated maybe for years at a time, but to what extent do you think having tight-knit relationship with your siblings, both while a child and now as an adult, has helped you and maybe the others cope?
First, I want to say that I've tried to take some of the good from a bad situation. And one of the good things is because we were kind of trauma bonded, but then at the same time not allowed to be in close proximity for so many. Like one of my sisters I did not see for 16 years. She ran away. She met somebody, got married. She left the cult and basically disappeared because they were risking their lives literally by doing that. But she's also one of the heroes of our story because she wasn't allowed to come back and associate with us, but she would anyways. She would like come back to town, find out what schools we were going to, do like her own detective work, and then she would like park her car along the route that we would take to get home, and she would meet us and talk to us and make sure to like don't tell anybody, but give us Christmas presents and just give us her phone number. Some of my older siblings, they had her phone number that they would just kind of tuck away in a hideaway spot, and then when they were like Celia, when she was ready to get out, that's the phone number she used and called. And Kathleen, edit that out. My older sister sent money, a plane ticket and money to get her a cab, to get her to the airport, to fly her to where she lived. And she did that for several of our siblings. And, I didn't see her for like probably 15 years. I didn't see her. And some of my older sisters were like basically my mom figure. Like, even though I loved my mom and she took care of us to what degree she could, a couple of my older sisters just had it in their mind that it was like, we need, education is important. Like my older sister that got out, when she was still in, she would save what paltry pennies that she was paid sometimes for being a slave, essentially, and buy us books and try to teach us how to read. And she just thought that was extremely important. And which came in later is that like my escape from the misery and the hell was reading. I just read voraciously through most of my young childhood and my teenage years. Just voraciously read as an escape whenever I had time.
I mean, I think that that's another coping mechanism, this reading voraciously and sort of escaping the world you're in by going into a world of books when you can't control your environment. I know you've talked about that. You're talking about that now. And
that also gave me a little bit of a foundation for understanding that the cult I was in had something wrong with it, because you're getting exposure through reading to other cultures and other ways of life and other thoughts and ideas, even though most of what I read was novels. Nowadays, as an adult, I read more technical stuff. I more enjoy learning how to do something, essentially. But then I was just an escape. But you're still exposed. Your mind is still exposed to some outside influence, and that helped a lot too.
I mean, it's the power of stories. I mean, it's the power of imagination and a book is the most poignant thing in the world to me, because somebody has taken the time to pour something out, whether it's a fiction or a memoir, and it's communicating one's internal experience to the reader. And so you had a chance to experience outside
influences.
Yeah, through that.
So you had the kind of support of your family or sisters, or kind of like the good support amid all the bad trauma and bad support. You had these escapes in books. Were there any other things that made you feel like you could get through, or gave you the confidence or the hope or the ability to go through those incredibly trying times, those literal periods of starvation?
I don't really have a good answer for that. Just survival. I was just trying to survive. I didn't have a lot of like hope for the future. I didn't know what the future would look like. I felt like I was trapped in this cult, that I never saw a way out until Dan Jordan was murdered. And then that was kind of the start of like, here's the way out. And even though I don't think that was the way it should have happened, I think that was wrong, but it was still my liberation from this life. And from that point on, it was just freedom. Let's get away from this as fast as we can. And I've just spent the rest of the last 30 years just getting away and using just survival instinct and a hodgepodge of coping mechanisms to get away and have a successful life. And reconnecting with all my siblings. Now we're all reconnected. My mom's children. What's weird about polygamy is when everything falls apart, generally speaking, it's along the lines of who the mother is, the cliques. And it's not perfect, but I am also reconnected with my dad's other children, my other siblings, half brothers and sisters. We're not quite as close, but we still friends on Facebook. When I'm in their town, I'll go visit them and things like that. My mom's children, we try to do a thing where once a year we all get together and get a Airbnb or rent a house somewhere like on a coast or something like that, somewhere fun, and then we all just meet up at that same place and just spend a week together bonding. And it started out after when Anna started writing her book, The Polygamous Daughter. She was trying to get all the facts straight, all the little details, and let's get all together so we can do this. And that's kind of how it started. And that was mostly what we talked about that first time. But we decided this is actually good for us. We need to just keep doing this. So we've been doing it ever since. And what's funny is it's over time, we talk about the old stuff less and less. We still do to some degree, but it's less and less and less. And now we have more other things to talk about, new memories that we've made. And we call each other on the phone all the time. And we have a group chat with all of my mom's kids. And just every day something's popping up in there telling each other about our lives and what's going on. And we're all very supportive of each other. We all have varying beliefs and stuff like that, but that's not we're all very accepting of each other's like various beliefs. We don't, we discuss things, but we don't argue.
But universally, everybody has shunned the teachings of the cult.
That's very important for everybody to understand, is the cult doesn't exist anymore. There's some people that, like, I don't remember the guy's name on the documentary that said, this book is still out there, this book of the New Covenant, and somebody could pick it up and start over. And no, that is not a thing. That doesn't exist. If anybody, I'd never read that book before, and there's only a few copies in existence. The first time I saw it was the day before I went on camera for the Daughters of the Cult. And I just read like a paragraph, and I was like, this is like insane ramblings. This doesn't make sense. This isn't clear. You can't build a religion off of this. It's just somebody mentally ill. It's very obvious. And then, so I flipped to a few more pages and read more. And it's like, this is even worse than the thing I was just reading. Like, is it just, there's nothing there. It's literally insane ramblings of an unwell mind. As you're reading through it, it's just, my dad was talking about how he's gonna, when he gets out of prison, he's gonna assign the warden of the prison he was in Utah as to be the governor of Utah. And he is the leader of this cell block, and everybody there does his bidding, and he's gonna appoint them to positions of power, and he'll just go off on these wild ramblings of just very verbose about how he is God's most humblest a servant of all, and his son, pick random son, is the most absolutely highest, most blessed by God, most loved, blessed, most, and like just ramblings that like nobody would read that and think like, oh, we're going to start something with this. The only reason that people were following it at some point is because they were brainwashed their whole life, abused their whole life, and they were still children when the 4 o'clock murders happened. They were 15, 16, 17-year-old children that were committing these acts. They didn't know any better. So these teachings had made some sort of sense for that reason only. Any rational person that picked this up and started reading it would just be disgusted. There's nothing logical in there. There's nothing you could build any religion off of. It's just insane ramblings, and that's the best way I can say it.
So, considering everything you've gone through to be where you're at, and by the way, the only questionable decision you made was enlisting at 35 to become an EOD technician. Do you consider yourself and your sisters resilient?
I think we've proved it. We're very resilient. So I think that goes without saying.
Okay. And then what I was going to say is we talked briefly about this before off camera about how the kind of like scarcity or the poverty or the period of imprisonment has created kind of an ingenuity in us and a willingness to do things in an alternative way. You bought a plot of land and built your own house and lived in an RV, and you've always taken this kind of like non-typical path because you're okay with having nothing. And you made the point about being willing to sometimes just like go back to the few things you can control, and I thought that was so interesting. Yeah.
I've seen worse than you can imagine. So to scale back and kind of live kind of a smaller lifestyle, not spending, like after I got divorced, I'm since remarried, but I was married before for 14 years. And after that divorce, I had nothing. Started with, I had a decent job, and that's about it. And 1989 Toyota pickup. Old, that was everything I possessed on this planet, and some clothes. And I just rented a room from someone, like paid him like $150 a month to live in that room, just ate simple meals that didn't cost any money, and didn't do any pleasure cruises, didn't party, didn't drink, nothing. I just reduced my expenditures to maybe $18,000, $20,000 a year, and any excess money I had, I just saved. After a couple of years of that, I was able to find a house that was on foreclosure, that was selling for pretty cheap because it was just an absolute dump, a wreck, but it was structurally sound. Bought that with the money I had, and then just lived in it and rehabbed it while I lived in it. The house didn't have any flooring. Every wall in the house had holes in it in the sheetrock. The cabinet doors ripped off of the hinges. Like every fixture was broken or damaged. It was just, there was no carpeting, there was no tile, no linoleum, nothing. It was just, but I could live in there because the air conditioning worked and the heat worked. So, and it was a roof over my head and it was dry. And the one room was like in the best shape. Like, that's going to be my room I'm going to live in, and I'm just going to start gutting the place and fixing it. And did that for several years till I got done, and then now I have a nice place to live and a little bit of equity.
So that sort of that having come out of such scarcity and knowing that you have endured such hardship gives you, in a way, this ability to know that you can shrink down or even do whatever you need to do to survive.
That lifestyle was better than I faced as a child, so it's still better than how I've lived before, so I know I can survive it.
What do you want people to take from your story? Your sisters talked about the importance of telling this story on their own terms and in sort of taking control of the narrative. And now you're stepping out. You were in the docuseries and now doing this interview here. What do you want people to take from your experience? Or do you hope they will?
It's been really cathartic for me to tell my story. And I used to be very angsty about not wanting people to know the story. There was till I was about 20, I actually went by a different name. I went by Marston as my last name for a long time. And when I was about 20 years old, I just decided I'm tired of living this lie. I'm tired of hiding this from people. So I'm just going to start talking about it. And I changed my name legally to LeBaron, because that's my real name. The other name I went by was my mom's first husband's last name. So that's what I went by. And it was surprisingly easy to change my name too. You just pay a little fee and fill out some paperwork, and the judge makes sure you're not trying to do it for some fraudulent reason, and they stamp it, and away you go. It was very easy. But another thing that I've been getting a lot of since the documentary came out is my inbox of various types, Facebook and texts from people that I knew at different duty stations and stuff. It's just been flooded with people telling me, and a lot of the theme is, here's some trauma that I've suffered as a child, and I've never told anybody this before. But after hearing you talk about it, it seems like I'm like a safe place that I can tell you this because you kind of understand. And one of the common refrains too is like, oh, it wasn't as bad as yours, but here's some horrific stuff that happened to me. And then they just tell me this very horrific abuse that happened to them. And I want people to understand, people that are out there suffering that have never told anybody their story, is I encourage them to find somewhere safe to tell that story. And I didn't anticipate that happening. It was a little bit of a surprise, but I also take it as an honor and a responsibility to tell them you did not deserve that kind of abuse. And this isn't like the Olympics where we're trying to get a medal of who suffered the most abuse. It's your trauma is trauma, regardless of how bad it was or who it came from or how it happened. It's still trauma, and you did not deserve that. And it's okay to talk about it. Find people that are safe and tell that story to them, whether it be a friend or a therapist or a pastor or a minister or somebody. Like, I'm not even religious, but generally speaking, that can be a safe place to find somebody to talk to. Whoever to get in to see a therapist, tell your story, because I've found it eased my burden so much to initially when I just decided I'm not going to be hiding this anymore. And I kind of went out of my way to talk to people. I'd find ways to bring this into conversation. And for a few years, it was just like kind of almost excessive, because it's like from clamped down so hard for so long that to release it was kind of like I was trying to find anybody I could tell the story to. And then it was cathartic. It was like, this feels good. And I thought I was going to receive rejection. It was like, this is so awful. Your dad was a terrible person. You must be too. And to this day, I've never gotten any bad reception from it. The most thing I get is just like, wow, that's interesting. Tell me more. And so I got finally comfortable talking about it. And then I just stopped talking about it because I'm just trying to live my life. I'm trying to have as much success and do as many experience life as fully as I possibly can. But then when my sister's book came out, The Polygamous Daughter, it kind of restarted again. I started talking about it again. And every time I tell the story, it's cathartic. Every time I tell the story, it just frees up a little bit more inside. And it's like, you feel a little freer and a little looser and the burden's a little bit less. And so I just want people to realize that this thing you're carrying around that you've never told someone or it's just still a burden, just find people to talk to about it. And you'll find ways to work through it on top of it just being cathartic to say it out loud. Somebody did this to me. This is what happened to me. It just loosens its hold a little bit more each time. So that's part of the reason for being here, is because every time I tell it, it's just a little bit less. And I want other people to see that, and to see that you can live through horrible, heinous things and still enjoy life and still have success and all the wonderful things that life has to offer. Even though life is difficult, even at the best of times, there's still joy and there's still beauty and there's still lots of good things to come from it.
Thank you for being here, and thank you for sharing it with us. I mean, that's a powerful message that I think we all need to hear sometimes, and I really appreciate it.
Yeah, thank you so much, Hyrum. This was great,
Thank you for
and I
having
really
me.
appreciate it.